Do you frequently find yourself worrying about possible negative outcomes of future events in your life? Does it weigh you down and hinder you in your career or relationships? Welcome to the Transformational Peace podcast, and I'm Dr. Lee. Catastrophizing is a common struggle many of us face, whether it stems from anxiety or worry or simply feeling overwhelmed. But hey, there's good news. You don't have to carry this burden alone. In today's episode, we will help you better understand catastrophizing and develop helpful, practical strategies to deal with it. And thank you for clicking on this video, and if it provides you with encouragement, please consider clicking the subscribe button below. Also, please share this video with someone you feel would find this information helpful. Hello friends, thanks for joining me, and I'm Dr. Lee. And today we'll be discussing catastrophizing. Catastrophizing is a cognitive distortion that involves magnifying and exaggerating the negative aspects of a situation while minimizing or overlooking any potential positive outcomes. This tendency is often fueled by anxiety, and it prompts people to jump to the worst possible conclusion, usually with very limited information. Individuals who engage in catastrophizing tend to jump to the worst-case scenarios, imagining the most catastrophic and disastrous outcomes. This thinking pattern often leads to an overwhelming sense of fear and anxiety. These thoughts can be irrational and unrealistic, further fueling their emotional distress. So in other words, catastrophizing can really complicate your life. Some of the causes of catastrophizing could be low self-esteem, negative thought patterns, a lack of coping skills, stress, perfectionism, past trauma, or anxiety. So I'm going to share a little scenario with you that will give you an example of what catastrophizing looks like. It was a hectic Monday morning at the office when a middle-aged man, a dedicated project manager, found himself worrying about an upcoming deadline. While sitting at his desk, he looked up and noticed a colleague walking towards him. At about the same time, he noticed a senior vice president walk up to this same colleague, and they began a conversation. As they're talking, he notices the vice president keeps looking over at him. The project manager thinks he recognizes that look that means, when I finish speaking to this person, I have something I need to talk to you about. The project manager's anxiety begins to increase, and he starts to think, what if he asks me something I don't know about him? I'll look incompetent and feel stupid. More anxiety creeps in, and his mind begins racing towards the worst-case scenario. He thinks of disappointing his team, failing to meet expectations, and just plain performing poorly. His heart races, and he struggles to focus on his tasks as his anxious thoughts seem to grow larger and more menacing by the minute. In the midst of his distress, his breathing becomes shallow, and he finds it increasingly difficult to shake off the overwhelming sense of impending doom. At that moment, both the vice president and his colleague turn and begin walking toward him. This is it, he tells himself. He begins ruminating about other minor mistakes he made and immediately envisions the worst-case scenario of losing his job and being unable to find another position, and ultimately facing financial ruin. At this point, his anxiety is literally through the roof, and he begins thinking about how he should begin interviewing for another job. As they arrive at his desk, the vice president begins speaking first. Hey, I was just speaking with Grayson, and he and I both thought it would be a good idea for you to go with us next week and meet one of our new clients and help us with planning for their new project. Can you imagine how surprised his project manager must have been when he heard these words? Unfortunately, in this situation, this pattern of thinking all too often can lead to heightened anxiety, decreased productivity, and strained relationships with colleagues when we become consumed by catastrophic thoughts. So now I'm going to give you some examples of 4 typical or common types of catastrophizing I often see. And the first is workplace catastrophizing. And much like you heard in the story I just told, this could be constantly fretting over small setbacks or fearing reprimands or termination for minor mistakes. And unfortunately, catastrophizing about work is a common phenomenon causing significant distress and anxiety in individuals. An example of catastrophizing at work could be when an employee receives negative feedback from a supervisor about a project, and instead of viewing it as an opportunity for growth, the employee automatically jumps to negative outcomes. And the next is relationship catastrophizing, and this could be when we are consumed by thoughts and begin thinking our partner will leave us, or thinking that a minor disagreement is a sign of an impending breakup, or noticing when a partner becomes less responsive and distant and jumping to the conclusion that your partner will leave you. This pattern of thinking can sabotage relationships and create unnecessary strain, and is also a common cognitive distortion that can have significant impacts on relationships. And next, I'm going to talk about health catastrophizing, and this could be fearing or imagining the worst case scenarios of health problems, which leads to excessive worry, hypochondria, and heightened anxiety. Catastrophizing one's health is also a common tendency and is clearly fueled by anxiety and fear. An example of this could be experiencing a minor headache and immediately jumping to the conclusion that we have a deadly brain tumor while envisioning a future filled with debilitating treatments, medical procedures, and a shortened life expectancy. And next and last, we're going to talk about parenting catastrophizing. This is where a parent constantly worries about their child's safety, academic success, or future. This type of catastrophizing as a parent leads to overprotectiveness and suffocating the child's development, and is also a common cognitive distortion that has detrimental effects when it comes to parenting. For example, a parent might catastrophize when their child faces a challenge at school, instantly imagining the worst-case scenario. The parent thinks that the child is failing academically and being labeled incompetent and will never achieve success. Becoming overly controlling and protective and micromanaging every aspect of the child's life often leads to a strained parent-child relationship. So now we see that catastrophizing is truly the art of amplifying anxiety. Catastrophizing is a distorted lens through which we anticipate and interpret events, which can cast a dark shadow over our lives. This common cognitive distortion convinces us that every challenge is an insurmountable catastrophe waiting to unfold. In our human experience, it is natural to occasionally worry or feel overwhelmed by life's uncertainties. However, when catastrophizing takes hold, it magnifies the power of anxiety to a daunting level. Everyday concerns that might seem manageable to others become tangled webs of imagined worst-case scenarios in the minds of catastrophizers. So now we're going to talk about what we do when we catastrophize and why. And first, what causes catastrophizing and what does it do to us? We've all experienced rejection or failure in our lives, and when we don't handle the situation well, we can trick ourselves into believing that if we expect the worst, we can prevent it, but the reality is the exact opposite happens. The worst becomes, unfortunately, much worse. When we do this, we cut ourselves off from opportunities and play out the exact difficulties we're trying to avoid. An example of this would be going into a conversation with others and expecting them to be defensive and starting off the conversation being critical and inflexible, which invites the other person to be defensive. Catastrophizing becomes a fertile ground for depression and anxiety, and when we play out a negative bias of hopelessness or ominous future, our brain responds in kind. Our physiology literally responds by creating less dopamine and serotonin, which are our feel-good and motivation chemicals. This leads to a pattern of withdrawal and poor motivation and depression. This is where our brain gets reinforced into confusing real or perceived threats, which means basically everything becomes a threat. This makes us very vulnerable to our fear response, which we often categorize as stress, anxiety, and worry. When we catastrophize, we limit ourselves, our thoughts and emotions become behaviors that are, quite frankly, difficult to change. So then the question becomes, if catastrophizing is so harmful and detrimental, why do we keep doing it? And first, some thoughts that lead to catastrophizing. So there are two main issues here. The first is feeling the need to prepare yourself for whatever disaster is about to come. And the second, pretty important, is believing that you won't have much control over the situation or the ability to deal with it. And the one way we try to deal with this is to search for the worst possible outcome, which is kind of like better the devil you know than the devil you don't. If you're motivated by this type of thinking, you'll find yourself preparing for the worst case scenarios, so you're not caught off guard. The problem here is not that it's just an exercise in disaster preparedness. You are overestimating, or good term here, magnifying the risks of a negative outcome, and then behave as if the outcome is inevitable. Some examples of this could be, I have a test coming up, and if I fail, I'll probably never get into college. Or, my supervisor keeps texting me and asking me questions about our project. I'll bet he thinks I'm not doing a good job and I'll probably get fired. If you were simply thinking of all the possibilities that you could simply be prepared for, The extreme outcome should motivate you to study harder in order to perform better. These additional efforts would give you more confidence such that you would be in a place of accepting the consequences because you know you did your best. That's what happens to the person who is thinking about the negative consequences and not catastrophizing. Very important point here. For the person who is catastrophizing, the negative consequence that you anticipate doesn't motivate you to change in the consequences. So people who are catastrophizing typically have low motivation. Thinking about them makes them even more anxious, and they start to believe that they're going to happen anyway, and you feel helpless to do anything about it. So instead of working hard to prevent the consequence, you prematurely give up and assume that this is your lot in life and nothing ever works out for you, so why change? It's a little like learned helplessness. Another way to recognize if you're catastrophizing, if you use absolute words like always, never, or only. These are rigid words that leave no room for flexibility. People who catastrophize are typically cognitively and emotionally inflexible. Some examples of this would be, I'll never have a meaningful relationship because I'm just unlovable. Or, I always get cheated out of what I'm due. Every time I try, I fail. It's also more than what you say, it's what you think. And when you catastrophize, this is a kind of negative thinking that makes you imagine and believe the most extreme negative outcome. You literally act on your thoughts by giving up on something because it looks hard. So in essence, you've already given up on a successful solution because you believe it's an impossibility. Often we tell ourselves, nope, I'm not going to try that because you believe you can see how something is going to end up and you're going to give up and just stay in your safe zone, which is not really a safe zone. Also, maybe we've grown up in a family where this is how everyone thought. This kind of thinking can often begin in early childhood and consequently becomes the norm, so we don't see it as a problem or a negative until someone else points it out. And finally, having a history of depression or trauma may also predispose individuals to catastrophic thinking, which makes sense since one of the hallmarks of depression is a tendency to ruminate over negative thoughts. So it's important to remember here that worst-case scenarios can be adaptive if it's just a quick thought to make sure you're prepared. However, more than often, people's thoughts spiral out of control into fear or worry that can lead to catastrophic thinking. So now I'm going to give you 3 helpful ways to deal with catastrophizing. And the first is recognize catastrophizing patterns. Recognizing catastrophizing patterns begins with cultivating self-awareness. It involves paying attention to our thoughts and reactions, especially in challenging or distressing situations. By acknowledging and understanding our tendency to catastrophize, we can take proactive steps to challenge and reframe these thought patterns. Developing a greater self-awareness also allows us to identify triggers and underlying beliefs that fuel catastrophic thinking. With this awareness, we can begin to intentionally shift our perspective, adopt a more balanced outlook, and ultimately reduce the impact of catastrophizing on our emotional well-being. Pay attention to your thoughts and feelings when faced with uncertainty or challenges. Recognize the tendency to jump to catastrophic conclusions. And the second is practice mindfulness. When catastrophizing, it is crucial to practice mindfulness and self-reflection to regain perspective and prevent escalating anxiety by tuning into our inner dialogue and beginning to recognize when catastrophic thoughts arise. Start by acknowledging the catastrophic thoughts without judgment. Take a moment to focus on the present moment and the here and now. Engage all your senses by noticing the sights, sounds, smells, and sensations around you. Gradually shift your attention to the facts of the situation, challenging the catastrophic thoughts with realistic and evidence-based perspectives. Ask yourself the question like, is what I'm thinking about a fact, or does it sound more like a false belief, or is what I'm thinking right now so important that my future depends on it? Remember that catastrophizing often involves hypothetical scenarios, so refocusing on the actual present realities can help dismantle the exaggerated or perceived versus real fears. By practicing mindfulness in moments of catastrophizing, you can cultivate a calmer and more balanced mindset. And the third is embrace self-compassion. When faced with catastrophizing, practicing self-compassion can be a powerful antidote. Catastrophizing often stems from perfectionistic tendencies and self-criticism. Rather than succumbing to exaggerated thoughts of worst-case scenarios, individuals can apply self-compassion by acknowledging their fear and anxiety with kindness and understanding. Encouraging oneself with words of reassurance and kindness can help counter the spiraling thoughts associated with catastrophizing. Additionally, recognizing that catastrophizing, as well as making mistakes and facing challenges in life, is a common human experience. Extending oneself the same sympathy and support as one would to a friend in distress can help foster a sense of calm and perspective. By embracing self-compassion, individuals can learn to reframe their catastrophic thoughts and approach challenges with a greater sense of hope and resilience. So I hope you found these tips helpful and remind you that catastrophizing can cast a dark cloud over your life. However, you can find the calm in the storm. By recognizing your patterns, practicing mindfulness and self-compassion, you can hopefully regain control over your thoughts and emotions. And remember, forgive your younger self, believe in your current self, and create your future self. I'm Dr. Lee.